In the vast network of abandoned mental hospitals scattered across America, there are stories that refuse to stay buried. Stories that seep through the cracked walls and broken windows, whispering of horrors that occurred long after the last patient was discharged. Tonight, I want to share 3 encounters that will make you question what truly lurks in the shadows of these forgotten places. Our first story comes from Sarah, a photography student who thought she'd found the perfect location for her senior project. The Willowbrook State Hospital in upstate New York had been closed for over 2 decades. Its sprawling campus left to decay in the wilderness. Sarah had heard whispers about the place online, seen the haunting images other urban explorers had captured, but nothing could have prepared her for what she discovered during her 3-day photography expedition. She arrived on a Thursday evening in late October, the kind of crisp autumn night where your breath creates small clouds in the air. The main building loomed against the darkening sky like a monument to forgotten suffering. Sarah had done her research, knew about the hospital's troubled history, the reports of patient mistreatment, the mysterious disappearances of staff members in the final years before closure, but she was focused on her art, not ghost stories. The first night passed without incident. Sarah set up her equipment in what used to be the main lobby, capturing long exposure shots of moonlight streaming through shattered windows. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional settling of the old building. She'd brought a sleeping bag and planned to camp in one of the more intact rooms on the ground floor. It was on the second night that things began to change. Sarah was reviewing her photos on her laptop when she heard it, a sound that made her blood freeze. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing from somewhere deep within the hospital. She sat perfectly still, listening, trying to convince herself it was just the building settling or perhaps a raccoon that had wandered inside. But the footsteps continued, growing closer. They had a rhythm, a purpose that no animal could replicate. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and camera, her photographer's instincts overriding her fear. If someone else was in the building, she needed to know. She followed the sound through the maze of corridors, past rooms filled with debris and decay, toward the hospital's east wing. The footsteps led her to a stairwell she hadn't explored yet. They seemed to be coming from above, from the hospital's upper floors that she'd avoided due to structural concerns. Against her better judgment, Sarah began to climb. The metal stairs groaned under her weight, each step echoing in the narrow space. On the 3rd floor, the footsteps stopped. Sarah found herself in a long hallway lined with patient rooms, their doors hanging open like mouths frozen in silent screams. She moved slowly, checking each room with her flashlight, but found nothing except the usual detritus of abandonment, overturned furniture, medical equipment left to rust, papers scattered across the floor. It was in the 7th room that she made the discovery that would haunt her for years to come. The room looked different from the others, cleaner somehow, as if someone had been maintaining it. There was a bed, not the rusted frame she'd seen elsewhere, but an actual bed with sheets and blankets. On a small table beside it, she found a journal, its pages filled with handwriting that looked fresh, recent. Sarah opened the journal with trembling hands. The entries were dated from just weeks ago, written by someone who claimed to be a former patient of the hospital. But that was impossible. The hospital had been closed for over 20 years. As she read, a chill ran down her spine. The entries described daily routines, interactions with nurses and doctors, treatments that sounded like they belonged in a medical textbook from the 1950s. But it was the final entry that made Sarah's stomach drop. It was dated that very day, and it mentioned her by name. It described her arrival, her photography equipment, even the fact that she was sleeping in the main lobby. The entry ended with a single line that made her legs weak. She's here to document our stories. Finally, someone will know what happened to us. Sarah backed out of the room, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She needed to leave, needed to get out of this place immediately. But as she turned toward the stairwell, she heard them again. Footsteps. But this time, they weren't alone. She could hear voices, whispers, echoing through the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. The voices were coming from the rooms she'd just checked, rooms that had been empty moments before. Sarah ran toward the stairs, But as she reached them, she saw something that stopped her cold. There were lights in the windows of the building's west wing, soft yellow glows that looked like electric bulbs. But the hospital had no power, hadn't had electricity in decades. She descended the stairs as quickly as she dared, the voices behind her growing into a cacophony of whispers, pleads, and what sounded like medical procedures being conducted. When she reached the ground floor, Sarah grabbed her equipment and ran. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, didn't stop driving until she was back in the city. It wasn't until she developed her photographs that she understood the true horror of what she'd experienced. In several of her shots taken in rooms she knew had been empty, she could see figures, translucent forms in hospital gowns, standing by windows, sitting on beds that shouldn't have been there. In one photograph, taken in the very room where she found the journal, she could see a man in a white coat writing at a table, his face turned away from the camera. Sarah never returned to Willowbrook. She changed her senior project, chose a different subject entirely, but she kept the journal she'd found, and sometimes, late at night, new entries would appear in it, written in the same handwriting, describing a hospital that existed somewhere between the world of the living and the dead. Our second story takes us to the abandoned Pennhurst State School in Pennsylvania, where maintenance worker David Chen thought he was just doing his job. David worked for a demolition company that had been contracted to assess the structural integrity of several buildings before their planned destruction. It was supposed to be routine work, a few days of measuring, photographing damage, and writing reports. David had worked on dozens of abandoned buildings over the years, but something about Pennhurst felt different from the moment he arrived. The complex was massive, dozens of buildings spread across hundreds of acres, connected by underground tunnels that had once allowed staff to move between buildings during harsh winters. Most of the buildings were already being reclaimed by nature, vines growing through broken windows, trees pushing through foundation cracks. He started his assessment in the administration building, working methodically through each floor, documenting the deterioration and safety hazards. The work was tedious but familiar, and David fell into his usual rhythm. It was when he reached the basement that things began to feel wrong. The basement of the administration building connected to the tunnel system that linked all the major structures on the campus. David's job required him to assess these tunnels as well, to determine if they posed any risks to the demolition work. He equipped himself with additional lighting and began his descent into the underground network. The tunnels were exactly what he'd expected. Concrete corridors lined with pipes and electrical conduits, most of which had been stripped out years ago. Water dripped from the ceiling, and the air was thick with a smell of mold and decay. David had been working in the tunnels for about 2 hours when he heard the first sound that didn't belong. It was music, faint but unmistakably music, coming from somewhere deeper in the tunnel system. David stopped walking and listened carefully. It sounded like it was coming from one of the residential buildings, possibly the children's ward that had housed the youngest patients. The music was old-fashioned, the kind of simple melodies that might have been used in therapy sessions decades ago. Following the sound, David made his way through the maze of tunnels toward the children's building. The music grew louder as he approached, and he began to make out other sounds as well. Children's voices, laughing and singing along with the music. But that was impossible. The building had been empty for years, and David had seen no signs of trespassers or squatters during his initial survey of the grounds. The tunnel ended at a heavy metal door that led into the basement of the children's building. The music was clearly coming from beyond this door, and David could see light seeping out around its edges. He tried the handle and found it unlocked. As he opened the door, the sounds became crystal clear. Children singing, adults encouraging them, the scrape of chairs on linoleum floors. David climbed the stairs from the basement, following the sounds to what had once been a recreation room on the ground floor. As he approached the room, he could hear individual voices. A teacher or therapist leading the children in song, someone playing what sounded like a piano. The light was brighter now, warm yellow light that seemed to be coming from functioning electric bulbs. He reached the doorway and peered inside, and what he saw defied all logic and reason. The room was fully occupied, filled with children sitting in a circle on small chairs all facing a woman at an upright piano. The children were singing a simple song, their faces bright and engaged. The woman at the piano was dressed in clothing that looked like it belonged in the 1960s. Her hair styled in a way that confirmed David's suspicion about the time period. But these weren't living children. Even from the doorway, David could see that something was fundamentally wrong with the scene before him. The children's movements were too slow, too deliberate, like a film being played at the wrong speed. Their voices, while sweet and innocent, had an otherworldly quality that made David's skin crawl. The woman at the piano turned toward the door, and David found himself looking into eyes that held no life, no warmth, no recognition of the present moment. She smiled and beckoned for him to enter the room, her movements mechanical and unsettling. The children turned toward him as well, their song continuing even as they moved their heads in perfect unison. David backed away from the doorway, but as he did, the singing stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the music had been. He could hear the scraping of small chairs across the floor, the shuffling of many feet moving in his direction. Without waiting to see what was coming, David ran. He sprinted back through the tunnels, his flashlight beam dancing wildly across the concrete walls. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of pursuit, small feet running, children's voices calling out to him in the darkness. "Come back, mister. Don't leave us. We want to show you something." David didn't stop running until he reached the administration building's basement. As he climbed the stairs to ground level, the sounds behind him faded, but he could still hear them echoing through the tunnels, growing fainter but never completely disappearing. He completed his assessment of the above-ground buildings in record time, working quickly and efficiently while trying to push the experience in the tunnels out of his mind. But when he submitted his report, David found himself unable to recommend the demolition of the children's building. Something in that building was still active, still aware, and he couldn't bring himself to be responsible for disturbing whatever was taking place in that recreation room. The demolition company was puzzled by his recommendation to leave the children's building standing, but they followed his advice. David never told them the real reason for his decision. Some secrets are too dangerous to share, and some places are better left undisturbed. Our final story comes from the abandoned Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, where security guard Marcus Williams discovered that some duties go far beyond what's written in any job description. Marcus had taken the security position as temporary work, watching over the partially demolished hospital complex while legal battles were fought over the remaining buildings. The hospital had a particularly dark history, having been the site of early lobotomy experiments and other questionable treatments. Most of the complex had already been torn down, but a few buildings remained, including the administrative offices and part of the original treatment facility. Marcus's job was simple: patrol the grounds twice each night and make sure no vandals or urban explorers were disturbing the site. The work was easy and well paid, perfect for someone between jobs who didn't mind spending his nights alone in a creepy location. Marcus had never been particularly superstitious, and he approached the job with a practical mindset of someone who'd worked security at dozens of different sites over the years. For the first week, everything was routine. Marcus would arrive at sunset, make his rounds, spend a few hours reading or watching videos on his phone, then make another patrol before dawn. The grounds were quiet, and he encountered nothing more threatening than the occasional raccoon or stray cat. It was during his second week that Marcus began to notice the lights. At first, he thought they might be reflections from passing cars or perhaps a glow from nearby buildings, but the lights appeared to be coming from inside the hospital, from floors and rooms that had no electricity, no functioning bulbs, no logical source of illumination. The lights were always brief, flickering on for just a few seconds before disappearing. They seemed to move through the building in patterns, as if someone was walking through the halls carrying a flashlight. Marcus made careful notes of when and where he saw the lights, thinking he might be dealing with trespassers who were very good at avoiding his patrols. On his third week on the job, Marcus decided to investigate more thoroughly. He equipped himself with a powerful flashlight, a radio, and a digital camera that could capture images in low-light conditions. Instead of his usual external patrol, he decided to enter the building and search for the source of the mysterious lights. The main entrance to the hospital was secured with heavy chains and padlocks. but Marcus had keys to everything on the property. As he unlocked the doors and stepped inside, he was struck by how different the building felt at night. During his daytime visits to check the locks and windows, the hospital had felt like any other abandoned building. But at night, there was a weight to the atmosphere, a sense of presence that made the hair on his arms stand up. Marcus moved methodically through the ground floor, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. He found nothing but the expected debris and decay of a building that had been abandoned for years. But as he worked his way through the hospital, he began to hear sounds that didn't match his own movements. There were footsteps in the hallway behind him, always just around the corner, always just out of sight. When he stopped to listen, the footsteps stopped as well. When he moved, they resumed, maintaining the same distance, the same rhythm. It was as if someone was following him, mirroring his movements but staying just beyond his line of sight. Marcus reached the main stairwell and began climbing to the second floor. The footsteps continued to follow, but now they were joined by other sounds. Whispers in the walls, the creak of doors opening and closing, the distant sound of what might have been medical equipment operating somewhere in the building. On the second floor, Marcus made a discovery that changed everything. In what had once been the hospital's main treatment wing, he found a room that shouldn't have existed. According to the building plans he studied, this area should have been empty space, but there was a door here, slightly ajar, with warm light spilling out from the crack. Marcus approached the door carefully and peered inside. What he saw made him question his own sanity. The room was fully operational, filled with medical equipment from what looked like the 1950s or 1960s. There were examination tables, IV stands, cabinets full of medications and supplies. And there were people in the room, doctors and nurses, dressed in period-appropriate uniforms, going about their work as if the hospital had never closed. But like the children David had encountered at Pennhurst, these medical professionals moved with an otherworldly quality that made it clear they weren't entirely human. They worked in slow motion, their movements deliberate and dreamlike. They spoke to each other in whispers that seemed to echo from impossible distances, and their faces, when Marcus could see them clearly, held expressions of intense concentration mixed with something that might have been regret. In the center of the room, on one of the examination tables, was a patient. Marcus couldn't see the person clearly, but he could tell they were conscious, their eyes wide with terror as the medical staff worked around them. The patient's mouth was moving, but no sound came out, as if they were screaming silently into the void. Marcus backed away from the door, but as he did, one of the doctors looked up and made direct eye contact with him. The doctor's face was gaunt and pale, his eyes hollow and filled with a sadness that seemed to encompass decades of regret. Without saying a word, the doctor gestured for Marcus to enter the room. Marcus turned and ran. He sprinted through the hospital's corridors, down the stairs, and out the main entrance without stopping to lock the doors behind him. He didn't stop running until he reached his car, and he didn't stop driving until he was home. The next morning, Marcus called his supervisor and quit his job, claiming a family emergency that required him to leave town immediately. He never returned to collect his final paycheck, never went back to retrieve the equipment he left behind in his haste to escape, but quitting the job didn't end Marcus's connection to the hospital. In the weeks that followed, he began to dream about the room he'd discovered, about the doctors and nurses continuing their work in that impossible space between worlds. In his dreams, he was the patient on the examination table, unable to speak, unable to move, while the medical staff worked on him with tools and techniques that belonged to a different era. These dreams became more frequent and more vivid as time passed, until Marcus began to suspect that his brief encounter with the hospital had created a permanent link between himself and whatever was happening in that room. He started researching the history of Danvers State Hospital, learning about the experimental procedures that had been conducted there, the patients who had disappeared from records, the staff members who had suffered mysterious breakdowns and been institutionalized elsewhere. Marcus discovered that the room he'd found matched descriptions from former employees who had reported seeing similar spaces in the years before the hospital closed. These witnesses had been dismissed as suffering from stress-related hallucinations, but Marcus now understood that they had been telling the truth. The abandoned mental hospitals of America are more than just empty buildings waiting for demolition. They are repositories of human suffering, places where the boundary between past and present becomes thin and permeable. The staff and patients who lived and died in these institutions left behind more than just memories. They left behind pieces of themselves, fragments of consciousness that continue to exist in the spaces where their most intense experiences occurred. Sarah's photographs captured evidence of this phenomenon, proof that the past continues to play out in rooms that should be empty. David's encounter with a children's therapy session showed him that some activities are so fundamental to a place's purpose that they continue even after the institution itself has been abandoned. Marcus's discovery of the operating room revealed that the most traumatic experiences leave the deepest impressions, creating pockets of time where the worst moments replay endlessly. These stories remind us that abandonment doesn't mean emptiness, and closure doesn't mean an end. The abandoned mental hospitals scattered across our landscape are monuments to both healing and harm, places where good intentions and terrible mistakes created legacies that refuse to fade away. As development pressures increase and more of these buildings face demolition, we lose not just architectural history, but something more profound. We lose the opportunity to understand how the spaces we create shape the experiences we have within them, and how those experiences can outlive the people who had them. The next time you pass one of these abandoned complexes, remember that you're not just looking at empty buildings. You're seeing places where thousands of lives intersected with hope and despair, where healing and harm walked side by side through corridors that still echo with the memories of all who passed through them. Some places hold on to their stories so tightly that they become the stories, existing not just as locations, but as living narratives that continue to unfold long after the final chapter was supposed to have been written. The abandoned mental hospitals of America are such places, and their stories are far from over. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, remember Sarah reviewing her photographs and finding faces in empty rooms. Remember David fleeing through underground tunnels while children's voices called out behind him. Remember Marcus discovering that some forms of treatment continue even after the patients are long gone. And if you ever find yourself near one of these abandoned institutions, if you see lights in windows that should be dark, or hear voices from buildings that should be silent, remember that some experiences are too powerful to be contained by something as simple as time, and some stories refuse to end just because the building that housed them has been left to decay. The abandoned mental hospitals keep their secrets, but sometimes, to those brave enough or foolish enough to listen, they're willing to share just a glimpse of the human dramas that continue to unfold within their crumbling walls. Reminders that the line between past and present, between memory and reality, is thinner than we'd like to believe.